That's the VPP problem right there, Joe. That's exactly it, right? The fundamentals of virtual power plant is that it is a bubble that will crash. Now, on January 1st, we will see the battery tariff for batteries made with Chinese battery cells, either from China or from a third party country of Chinese battery cells. It's going to go up 15%. Probably the three things that can happen in trade. For sure, we know the duty goes up 15%. Possibly inverters are banned. And then we'll see what happens with enforcement on batteries.
All right, welcome back to the Solar Surge podcast. Now, if you're new to the Solar Surge podcast, on this program, we meet with the top CEOs and the top thought leaders in the solar and energy storage space. And this afternoon, I've got a special guest back for the third time this year with us. James Showalter is the CEO and founder of EG4 Electronics. James, our audience always responds very well whenever you come on the podcast or whenever we do content together. So very good to have you back, and welcome back to the channel.
Thanks for having me, Joe.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So, James, last time we sat down and talked, it was before the so-called Big Beautiful Bill had been finalized. And it looked like there was a glimmer of hope that maybe we could push for a more gradual sunset to the 25D tax credit. Of course, that didn't happen. And so now as we're about to go into 2026, it appears that we have some clarity on the tax credit policy. I've got some more questions about tariffs and some other things that are affecting it. But James, from where you sit, how do you see the solar policy and tax credit landscape, and how are you setting yourself up to lead your organization as we go into 2026?
Yeah, Joe. I mean, good recollection. It was a very fluid time. I think what we were both looking for in that process that we were in was that we could end up in a more transparent and free market place. I think, unfortunately, what really came out of that was corporate interests that were, doing leases, getting all of the benefit, and the individual homeowners getting cut out. And I doubt it's actually going to save the government money. I think it'll cost them more. But, that was that's the democratic process, going into next year, I think you've got a few different segments where people are going to be playing with the new tax credit policy. So there are we have received the safe harbor guidance letter from the Treasury. So there are some safe harbor gambits that hardware and finance companies are looking to utilize to safe harbor what would otherwise be non-compliant fiat hardware for next year. There's an extent of how much money and hardware can be capitalized in that, but there are ways where you can do some customization, Joe. It has to have a real valuable purpose, and people are working on these packages over the next few weeks or the last month or so, and they customize a batch of hardware, and it gets to be treated under 2025 rules for use in leases, right? And so there's going to be kind of a hangover with companies that may not be compliant with FIOC, that will still be able to be getting those tax credit benefits through a lease vehicle that safe harbored them this year. So I think a lot of Chinese companies are going to do that, definitely to make sure they comply. And then even some American companies with high levels of Chinese content, you're seeing safe harbor deals announced by some big public players that are non-Chinese, and some of those opportunities are because of, they'll need to cut their China content to be compliant going forward. So there'll be a safe harbor hangover into Q1, Q2, where you're going to have different, hardware and finance vendors, where the hardware is now partnered with a particular finance vendor. It can't be portable to other finance vendors. And that is ultimately creating a package where the installed price of the system can feel like it gets the tax credit. So that'll be something that we see kind of in that phase one period, probably petering out Q2, Q3. There probably won't be as much safe harbor hardware left over. And I think ultimately, there's not going to be enough safe harbor for overall market demand. So some people start feeling the effect of just, the cash fall of no tax credit sales January 1st. So that'll be a factor we see, though, because I think some of the hardware companies are going to be doing that. After that, to your point, Joe, I mean, the reality January 1st is that residential in homeowner-owned solar doesn't get the tax credit. There are going to probably, I think you're going to see more players with these kind of prepaid PPA approaches that allow for temporary 7-year ownership of the system by a tax equity vehicle that pays you for your tax credit, maybe monitors your system, takes a little bit of maintenance responsibility for those 7 years, and ultimately flips it back to you at the end of all that. So that may have a positive effect. I'm worried it could be done wrong so many ways, but it could have a positive effect where the original 25D tax credit was only good against, people who owed taxes. And so a lot of people never were able to utilize that monetarily. So this may actually be a good side in general, but those structures, right, whether it's a prepaid PPA or a TPO, that's a 20-year power purchase agreement where the homeowner's locked into that, they're going to require compliant hardware. And where we have another cliff, right, is July 1st, where after July 1st, you're going to drop the solar tax credit drops by 40%. And then it drops another 40% the year after, and then down to zero. So the solar tax credit starts dropping middle 2026. And some people will try to safe harbor, I'm sure, some solar projects before the drop, right? But safe harbor, I don't think is going to demonstrate, the capacity need of the industry, right? As we still face an energy crisis in this country. And so what does that mean? Well, in the solar and storage world, you're going to be in a spot where if you start with your battery first, the battery tax credit goes to 2032 and it's not being diluted. So if you co-locate a battery and a solar system on the same project, you can move your soft costs, your permit costs, your labor costs. You can put them all on the battery, get the tax credit on that, and then have little to no tax credit on the solar and sell the solar at materials cost. So we could see a play where if I install my battery at my target price, I'll sell you $1 a watt solar or less, right? Because I just got to pay for, some panels. They could be FIAC. I got to pay for racking. I got to pay for the mounting of those panels. So we could see $1 or less, right, on the panel play post June or July, right? We could start to see those kind of things really pan out. So then the problem is the future of all that depends on batteries, because the battery credit inherently is going to go, the distance for 7 years. And you still have to figure out what's a mechanism where you get customers engaged, because a lot of them aren't going to want to sign on to a 20-year power purchase contract. They're locked in and being used like that. So maybe the prepaid PPA structure gets you there, but then you're going to need batteries. And I think you're going to see much higher battery attachments, especially after the solar cliff starts to get dropped, where you go from a 30% tax credit down to a 18% tax credit after I think it's July 1st, but don't quote me on that. Next year, it's middle of next year. So you're going to see these strategies where people need battery first. And so I think, though, the thing that we've tried to recognize at EG4 is like some fundamental problems with the supply chain is going to come down to you're going to need a reliable cost, compliant battery supply chain to stay in the EPC market. I think the financiers and the people who are doing these tax equity vehicles are going to figure out the right package for customers. And as long as they're doing it in a transparent way, we won't have another consumer protection issue. I think that hopefully we can police the industry a little bit with transparency efforts like what you do, Joe. So, we'll probably just see what's cooking in March and May of next year on the tax equity structures. But I think the core ingredient is going to be, compliant battery hardware. And the problem is that those compliance metrics are going to get harder and harder. Now, so that's I think your initial round one is a safe harbor hangover, and then 6 months where maybe it's business as usual and we kind of figure out solar and storage solutions or solar only solutions that have a tax credit utilization structure that's good for the customer. We get multiple different types of products out there that work for the customers within the law. And then ultimately a battery focus by middle of next year, where it's going to just be imperative you have a battery and the way that these systems work.
Interesting. James, as I've said in the past, like one of the things I really don't like about the industry is how much creative and exotic financing there is out there, to where you have to have a third party financier. And then of course, a lot of the financing is based on the assumption of a certain tax credit or some government incentive. It's interesting because I get different feedback depending on who I talk to. I've talked to some solar industry insiders, people that work, executives at some of the largest companies. You know them, that are telling me things like what you just said, like, well, actually, maybe I ought to take out a loan and then use the loan to do a prepaid lease, and then I'll get a better deal, and then I can buy it back from them later for $1. And so all this stuff, but at surface level to me, it's like, wait a second, we still haven't learned our lesson, right? I thought the lesson was, if we can just get all this complexity and all this dependence on incentives out of it, and just see who actually just wants to buy solar and a battery, I think we'd have a much more healthy supply demand balance and can build a business off that. Now, on the other hand, I get it, right? In theory, if you can manage that, and there's a way that you can take advantage of the tax credit, or partner with an entity that can take advantage of a tax credit and pass that on to you into what ultimately becomes a cheaper, lower cost solar system, then I guess it makes sense. I talk to people that do more business internationally, and a lot of times what they're telling me is they're actually glad to see incentives go away for solar in the United States, because again, it'll kind of get us to a truer sense of what the real demand is for solar, and then build capacity to deliver on that demand. But I guess I can see both sides of it. James, what's your take?
Well, I think what we had here with, I mean, obviously exotic financing took the cake in Congress this year. And, we had intrinsically as a market, Wright's law is something that I go back to, which is the old aircraft manufacturing rule of thumb that, hey, for every doubling of capacity, you reduce the cost 20%. And I think solar and storage was headed in that direction, where if we had, and it's if we had maybe another 2 rounds of that, we would have outpaced the 25D phase out, which is where we were pushing for, just an equal phase out by the end of 2027, early 28, right? So we didn't get that. And where we're at today is there are opportunities that may fill that financial gap, right? With a virtual power plant, I think, being one of the key ones, where you could get $7,000 to $10,000 of 5-year revenue off of your system, if it's a storage system, where the grid company, it's a free market subsidy on your batteries that, it's basically providing a service, and it increases the value of the system. And that could be, if it's used right, that could pay down your solar loan, right? If it was a full finance pitch, and you could essentially get the 30% back. So do we want to end up in a market where it's complete pure competition? Absolutely. One of the things that I think is really unique about our hardware play next year, which is based on that 100-volt system, is we're building domestic content compliant batteries, and we're building FIOC batteries as cheap as we can. Right. And so we're basically going to have a two approach, where the people who are trying to go at this at an ownership only level, whether it's a loan or cash, we're going to have the absolute best storage price system on the market, and also utilizing that next generation technology. The problem you're dealing with when exotic financing won, and it did, and it's here to stay for the next 7 years, is that it's going to distort the market. If you're an EPC and there's a solution that's just going to give you more profit per job, right? You're not going to go and install systems. My do-it-yourself customers over at Signature, they're going to do the ownership thing out of principle, right? And that's the way I would do it for my family back when I was building DIY systems. But I don't see EPCs willingly leaving profitability on the table. And I also think that the prepaid PPA structure could go wrong, but it could go right. And the reason why it could go right is that you and I know that the banks were signing straight out finance solutions before, that they weren't quality controlling. They didn't take any level of ownership. And now the prepaid PPA structure, it's not a 20-year, bondage agreement for the homeowner to pay a, price per month, that they're being exploited by. But at the same time, it is 7 years of initial responsibility, making sure that a decent system was installed, and the financier is on the hook for it. So there's an argument that says the prepaid PPA approach could be a good thing, or could be a better thing than straight out financing, because you have a third party financial expert who actually has a responsibility that system's working over the next 6 years. You have a non-working system in 6 years, they're going to have a problem with the tax credit. So they have to think about that too. So it's Yeah, unfortunately, it's not like I don't think we're getting to go one direction or the other, Joe. I think it's kind of we got the world that was handed to us. And so I think your EPCs that are trying to convince solar skeptic homeowners are going to try to use every tax credit play in the book. They'll probably use tax credits and VPP and try to create a low monthly payment that just makes more money for them and saves more money for the homeowner. And hopefully we can keep an eye on how the customer ethics are working there, and make sure we have open conversations about some risks around VPP and TPO, right? That I think homeowners need to be advised on, especially with all these long-term 20-year contracts people are doing right now. So I think that's one concern that we'll have to deal with because it's the reality we're living in. At the same time, your dollars and cents batteries, in theory, can get lower, but I think the problem is going to be what's the tariff environment on Chinese batteries going to be? I mean, if it's stable, that's one thing, but more and more batteries are becoming the whole tariff conversation is driven by batteries becoming part of the defense interest of the United States. We don't, I think that we're concerned about not having enough battery manufacturing in the United States because it's a defense supply chain.
Yeah, well, I mean that's a whole nother conversation as well. But I mean, there's so many things we could dive into there, James. Before we switch gears and talk more about tariffs, because I would like to get your view on the tariff situation, right, separate from the tax credit issue. But as you said, the world that we've been given is one where there are government incentives, at least for the next 7 years. There are significant government incentives that affect the financeability of a solar project, and so there is going to be a demand for these third-party financing partners, financing entities that can help monetize on tax credit or help monetize on VPP programs. I guess for me, especially someone who got into this industry as more of this self-reliant emergency preparedness mindset, which is that, well, now you've got all this other counterparty risk. You've got the risk that the leasing company is going to be well managed and stay in business. We've seen a number of solar lease companies go bankrupt in the past year and a half. Then there's a question of these virtual power plant programs. Is the power company going to honor those agreements for 5, 10, or 20 years? I think, James, when you were on an earlier interview this year, you brought to light an issue that you're seeing particularly down there in Texas, which is that a number of these solar systems were sold on 25-year loans to homeowners with an assumption of 25 years of energy savings, but the net metering agreements were only for 1 or 2 years. And so the homeowner
That's
thinks they're going to be selling power for 25 years, but it's really only a 2-year deal. And then who knows if they're going to get anything. So,
that's
you know,
the VPP problem right there, Joe. That's exactly it, right? The fundamentals of virtual power plant is that it is a bubble that will crash. It is not going to be worth the same amount in definitely 10 years and probably 5 years. What is a virtual power plant? It's basically we're paying you for the value of putting energy in a battery and taking it out of the battery. Well, that's a coefficient of how many batteries are deployed on the grid and what's the price of those batteries. And we know two things are going to change in the next 5 to 10 years. More batteries will be connected to the grid, and the cost of those batteries are going to drop. So what's a responsible way to do it? I think what you're going to see as a consumer protection is exactly that. Some liar is going to go into grandma's house and they're going to tell her that you're getting $2,000 a year in virtual power plant money when she's only going to get 500 in 5 years. And so there a responsible way to do it, to utilize it? I think so. I think it would look like a principal prepayment structure where the virtual power plant money flows directly to your loan partner as bonus payments. And something like that is, hey, grandma, you're on the hook for $350 a month, okay? But the power company, we did sign you up for a program. We're estimating in the next 5 years, and we don't pitch more than 5 years. It'll put maybe $7,000 to $10,000 off your loan. So while you're paying your loan down, maybe your loan payment comes down to $230 instead of $350, while everyone else's power bill goes up. Maybe that approach would be ethical and transparent. But what I think you're going to see happen is, some dishonest person putting the VPP revenue up into the right for 20 years. And that's exactly the problem that we're looking at. Also, I think we definitely have a 5-year energy crisis. We may not have a 10-year energy crisis. I mean, the amount of generations coming on board, you look at the S&P global, get together they had down in Houston, they're talking about, industry trends, and energy prices could start coming back down in the middle 2030s. Well, what if people are signing on to PPAs that have 2.5% escalators that were comped right now, but now they've got compound 2.5% 10 years from now? Now you've got upside down deals. I mean, in this business, It's fun to sign an upside down deal because the inherent profitability, but it's really bad to own one. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think those are two definite opportunities. And then to your other point, Joe, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think maybe going public with a TPO is not a great idea. Maybe doing TPO financing in tranches that are basically insured, and there's reserve money that's getting some kind of verification that is being managed well. Could create an approach that keeps this from mixing public shares or public equity with the leverage situation, or just all the other things that went wrong. And also the duration of the TPOs that have busted. A lot of them are a lot longer than 6 or 7 years. 6 or 7 years is typically a pretty good sweet spot, which is why I think prepaid PPA could actually be a very, very valuable approach. The longer term approach, you really have to be aggressive and careful. I would like to see long term 20-year PPAs at a fixed price that's saving money today, right? I'd like to see people be able to save 30% on their energy, and that price stays the same over 20 years, not increases every year. I think that's where we could create a bankruptcy bubble where, I mean, grandma realizes it's better just get power from the grid, and it's much more reliable and cheaper now in 2035. And some TPO guy thought he was a genius selling her an escalator that went from 14 cents up to 22 cents. and and she's at 14 now, back down to 14 because the power curve has dropped.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I guess that gets to the larger question of, should solar be sold to grandma in this fashion? Like, should we have this attitude like, hey, solar and batteries are for everyone, no money down, easy monthly payments? Or should we have a more natural, organic demand of people that want solar because they want it, whether for financial reasons, environmental, emergency preparedness, what have you? But like, do you see a future, James, where 5 years from now you're still going to have door-to-door teams canvassing neighborhoods, evangelizing solar to anybody that could possibly do it?
See, that's always been a tough question. You got to figure out, what you really support in a market, right? What I would say is that if you were trying to sell a $50,000 or a $30,000 investment as a certified financial planner with a 20-year projection, he would have to follow a lot of regulations to sell that to grandma, right? But apparently, if you knock on doors and sell a $50,000 solar system or a $60,000 solar system with batteries, whatever, you don't have those restrictions. Now, do I like regulating additional industries? That's the counterpoint. I don't. So I don't know. I think what you're seeing is states create consumer protection issues. I mean, look how stacked up the attorneys general are with consumer protection issues with solar, and of course they're working on different theories of can you contract yourself out of your financial promises, which is what those door knockers are a lot of times doing. They're ethical and valuable door knockers, but you're also looking at just so many boundaries that the sales agencies have to decide to engage in honest business. And unfortunately, right, there's not necessarily the restrictions there. So do I think we see the market end up policing itself? Yes, I think the development of better and better business models, like let's get honest prepaid PPAs out there. Let's get honest VPPs out there. And ultimately, let's make it easier for people, and let's create better, and more highly circulated media channels like yours that can try to create an honest and intelligent conversation. But are there always going to be people who are selling home services to elderly people and being dishonest about it? Yes, I hope we can innovate on consumer protection some to a point where we're not creating a completely ridiculous burden to doing business at all. So, there's intentions. I don't really know how we get to that future, right? Where we can get the word out. There's a transformative technology that can make you energy independent and save your family money, and at the same time, also try to stop people from overselling that. I think that the companies that have done that have just been good at going bankrupt and cut and run tactics. Um, we'll have to see, Joe. I mean, it's just it kind of stumbles into more of a fundamental question there of how does the marketplace weed out bad business, right? And what's the role of and what are formulas for regulations that can in some way productively affect that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you touched on it a little bit earlier. You mentioned that, there are regulations for how you can sell a financial product to grandma, right? Or to anybody, right? There's certain disclosures. You have to disclose what the risk factors are, right? There's risk of loss. You've heard these things for advertisements for financial products. Because essentially with a TPO type structure, you are essentially selling a financial product. You're not necessarily selling electricity. You're selling a network of agreements that ultimately is providing electricity to your home, but you're essentially selling a financial structure around all of that between the different parties that is in most cases at the time of sales is selling a certain amount of projected future savings. So but I guess time will tell. James, let's switch gears a little bit now and talk more about tariffs, because that's the other side of this piece. And frankly, from my perspective, it feels like this is the one where we have the least amount of certainty, because it seems like the tariff policy could change on a month by month basis. But how do you see it as it looks today, as you're going into 2026 here within the month? And what do you see as some of the risk factors that your company and other companies in the space need to consider with respect to tariffs?
Okay, yeah, I mean, import regulations just in general, right? There's several factors at play. There's a U.S.-China factor that we're going to have to deal with. So I think a week ago there was, I'm sure you saw this, Joe. There was a letter to the U.S. Trade Representative at the executive branch asking for a complete ban on importing Chinese inverters, right? And that's an incredibly important part in any Chinese ESS, or these Chinese players that want to try to just do the cash and fiat market. You have 40 members of Congress that signed that letter, right? And that is asking for a total shutdown, right, of that. So when we talk about duties, a lot of times our answers are centric around China. And that is, I think, stumbling into, I think, what I call the Huawei problem, right? Huawei came into Texas, set up shop in Plano, started getting market share in network routers and other components. And, within a few month period, you started hearing about it, and then they were shut down and they had to leave and go back to China, because ultimately the U.S. does not want its infrastructure run on hardware that is controlled by Chinese companies, right? And definitely, if the company that owns the IP is Chinese, you've got that problem. So you're going to have a factor there that's bigger than the amount they charge, right? Because no is no at that point. So, I mean, we'll have to see. I think that'll be one of the things we'll see in the next few weeks. I mean, is that the world we're going to live in, where we have, no, you can't be bringing in inverters from China, right? That would dud a lot of new entrants into the market, right off the get go. And also, how would they deal with Chinese owned IP if it's manufactured in some third party country to try to, launder that away? So we don't know. I mean, obviously, that's one factor to begin with. And then you've got the tariff rate on batteries. There's actually an old clawback from the Biden 2024 package of tariffs on batteries, Chinese batteries they approved for EVs and batteries. And on January 1st of this coming year, battery duties are going to go up 15%. I'm not sure if you're aware of that.
Can you say that again for the audience, please?
Yeah, on January 1st, we will see the battery tariff for batteries made with Chinese battery cells, either from China or from a third party country of Chinese battery cells. It's going to go up 15%. So that's another factor for the cash and fiat guys. Right now, they're bringing in batteries for cheaper than they will be able to bring them in next year, except for another tariff related problem, and that is enforcement. Especially when you've got industries where there's heavy state investment in China. There are factories everywhere. They're all desperate to sell product, export product, get the export VAT from the Chinese government. You're looking at a lot of illegal devaluation, which is another problem with tariffs, where we're in a position where we're still accepting an exporter's value of the goods they're putting in, right? And a lot of times the practice with Chinese companies, if you check the import records, is they don't import under their own name. Some of them don't, and there's a loophole there where you could basically just use a DDP agent and have that third party shell corporation devalue your goods maybe 80%. So you try to get out of the tariffs. The problem with that is you're going to end up with you could end up, obviously it creates significant liability if you're trying to build a long-term sustainable company in the United States, but it would be at the end of the day, if your goal is to just push product from a Chinese factory, that's a way to bring it into the US at a 30% price advantage, or as much price advantage as you need. And so that's definitely been happening a good bit this year. If you track the import records from key brands that, look like they're super cheap. Like, how did they get so cheap? Well, yeah, I mean, it's brilliant illegal behavior, right? So, will the U.S. get serious about enforcement of the? I mean, obviously, they're right now so serious on inverters not driving the infrastructure. They're looking at a total ban. Will the U.S. get serious enforcement, at least enforcement on batteries? Or are we going to see something like a total ban on Chinese batteries? Or are we going to see, an enforcement structure where there's like a minimum value that's based on weight because you can't cheat weight, right? Those are some questions that I think trade policy wraps around, even if we don't touch the tariff rate more than the 15% bump. So, because all this feeds into the cash market. Your cash guys are like looking at some Chinese company maybe that's like dropping stuff in and it's shockingly cheap. And some of those companies are law abiding and they're following the tariffs, but you've got other ones where there's no import records for them, weirdly, and they're surprisingly cheap. And we'll have to see how that affects the overall supply of cost-effective options, right? That's the other weirder aspect to tariffs. And that I think that's probably the three things that can happen in trade. For sure, we know the duty goes up 15%. Possibly inverters are banned, and then we'll see what happens with enforcement on batteries.
Okay, so what does that mean? From when you and I last spoke, let's say 6 or 9 months ago, about EG4's plans for domestic content and U.S. manufacturing. Will you used to be able to produce your product? Because I think you all are you currently or planning to very soon manufacturing your inverters in Texas, right?
Yeah, so we've been manufacturing since August. There's a made in USA requirement. We're saying assembled in the U.S. We're not yet made in USA rated because we don't have enough American content for the made in USA sticker on the inverter. But we are at a place where I think the key thing is compliance, ownership of IP on the inverters, and we've restructured to accommodate those needs. And we've also moved our supply chains for the inverters, majority out of China. So that will help us continue to get, compliance on a reduced cost inverter with the manufacturing subsidies that we get going into next year, and continue to ramp up. I think we'll do about 4 times as many inverters produced in that Texas factory next year than we're doing this year, and you'll see some price reductions based on us kind of crossing a profitability threshold where we can actually reduce our hardware costs. The battery supply chain is going to be the key driver of like domestic content compliance, because that's the majority. The battery and the battery cells the majority of the dollars and cents on these projects, and that's where the LG partnership we announced and have started production and payments on for $2 billion of American-made battery cells out of Michigan is something that comes into play next year.
Makes sense. Okay. Well, let's switch gears a little bit now while we have some more time and talk more technical. So when I last saw you in person in Las Vegas, you had unveiled a soon-to-be released high-voltage all-in-one solution known as Nova or Nova Core Pro, using a new 100-volt architecture. Can you explain a little bit more why the move to a 100-volt architecture from what we would typically expect a 48-volt nominal architecture for your Power Pro system?
Yeah, Joe, it's a great question. I think the battery industry has been 48 and 400. And the thing about the 400 volt is it's not really a 400 volt in most cases. It's a 48 with a buck booster that boosts it up to 400 volts. So you have a 48 volt battery and your inverter has an onboard 48 volt to 240 volt buck booster, right? That boosts up to the 400 volt DC bus, and then it comes out with 240 volt AC, right? So it's a high voltage differential. So the inverter's less efficient, or you have a high efficiency inverter, takes 400 volts, feeds it right into the 400 volt bus, comes out with 240 volts AC, very efficient. But the battery's not as efficient because the battery's converting the voltage. So either way, your problem with battery design is limited to your battery cells and the kinds of packs you can build. And we look at the size of packs coming up, right? You can buy really small cells. Each cell is 3.2 volts, Joe. You can buy really small cells and try to string them up to a native higher voltage. But the small cells are not as cost effective. But what we see is really the demand for virtual power plant partner systems where you can build a bigger battery cheaper per kilowatt hour than the small ones. And we think, okay, well, what we thought was instead of putting any kind of buck boosting, let's build a native voltage with big cost effective cells at 100 volts. So we're actually increasing the overall round trip efficiency of the system. And so that comes down to cell economics. You've got 314 amp hour, which is dominating the industry. The American made LG JF2S and JF2 cells are going to be 160 amp hour. You've got a 206 amp hour standard in China as well. And so we basically said we could build an architecture where the inverter is doing only 100 volts to 240 AC out instead of 48 volts to 240 AC out, doing, instead of 3.5 times, it's doing instead of doing 7 times, it's doing about 3.5 times out on the DC buck. So it's more efficient and more power for the same components. We could build a next generation cost because it's actually cheaper for us to build these bigger 100-volt batteries that we think would be easier to install. So we looked at the batteries we could build. We started with that, and then we saw this as an opportunity for us to release a battery solution that partners with an inverter solution where the inverter efficiency and cost economics are improving, while the battery economics are also improving as they go to these bigger form batteries that are more optimized for grid service revenue, that short-term grid service revenue, which also creates better backup for the home. So with the LG cell in our repertoire next year, we could build either a 16 kilowatt hour or a 60 kilowatt hour 100-volt battery. So we need an inverter to partner with that. And then in the import battery, we looked at an opportunity to build a 20 kilowatt hour, even better cost effectiveness than our 16 kilowatt hour 48-volt battery. That would partner with the inverter, which would help our cash customers. So it just felt like the right way to solve the technical problem. And it wasn't kind of, putting a buck booster in the battery versus putting in the inverter. Like, it wasn't just moving deck chairs around, which is what tends to happen in the high voltage, low voltage conversation.
Interesting. Very interesting. Well, you mentioned earlier about, you really want to think of the battery first. We were talking about tax credits earlier, right? Like, build the system around the battery. Now, look, you and I have been doing this longer than a lot of people that are going to watch this podcast. But, as you know, right, the off-grid community, basically it was 12, 24, 48 volt systems back in the day. And you would build the battery banks yourself using either 2-volt or 6-volt deep cycle batteries. And the dominant chemistry at the time was flooded lead acid, like lead plates and sulfuric acid. So this is where like the 48-volt standard came when those were the type of batteries that were being used. It seems like everything now is going to LFP, and frankly, the boundary between the battery and the inverter system is really starting to blur, because it seems like the trend is really now moving more towards all-in-one systems. Even your EG4 Power Pro system, it's an all-in-one system now. Yes, I guess technically you could break it apart and bring in a third-party battery, but I don't know how much more of that we're going to see in the future. What do you think?
Lots of permitting nightmares when you do that. I think it's become something that people are doing if they find a 48-volt generic battery from a Chinese company that is suspiciously cheap, right? Because of that the tariff enforcement problem. But if you're in an area where you got to actually pass a permit, people are have to be figuring out, did this really integrate with the inverter well? If it's a non-reputable knockoff 48-volt battery, did it actually have the 9540 test passed? And I think the 24-volt to 48-volt jump is a really good equivalent to what we're dealing with, Joe, when we're going from 48 to 100-volt. Ultimately, as we're getting to the kind of power that homes expect in that 16 to 24 kilowatt range, when they've got EVs and virtual power plant and other things, the 100-volt architecture is going to be a better fit. Just like with the bigger off-grid systems, 48-volt was a better fit than 24-volt. And I think that ends up becoming a shift that we might be the first ones to go there, but we will definitely not be the last ones. It's just the intrinsic economic of battery cells that are going to drive everyone to 100-volt, non-buck boosted or more battery. I mean, we might see go to 150 or something.
Interesting. So then what is the future of the 48-volt standard? I mean, do you think that there's still an ongoing need for 48-volt systems?
I think it's the same way that 24 volt kind of phased out over a 5-10 year period in the industry, right? There's going to be a lot of systems where they're 48 volt already, and they're going to want to, upgrade them with additional 48 volt batteries. So there'll be a huge demand there. There are going to be people that take time to, adopt and trust the next standard for low voltage inverters, which would be 100 volts, I think. So you're going to have people that, just feel more comfortable. They have smaller systems where they don't really, they don't need 16 kilowatts of power from a 100 volt inverter. They'll build with a 8 or a 10 kilowatt inverter, and so why not just get a 48 volt battery to go with that? So smaller systems might be a hangout for 48 volts. The transition overlay that's there, and then also, exchangeable parts. That's exactly what happened with the 24 volt systems. People were building 24 volt systems, way back. I mean, way after they were no longer cutting edge. So I think 48 volts, 2025. I think you won't be seeing near as much of it in 2030. Probably not near as much in 2028, but definitely still a lot over the next 3 years.
Good deal. Good deal. Well, James, as always, you're a wealth of knowledge, and I know the audience really appreciates the insights that you have. While we still have a little bit of time left, is there anything else that you'd like the audience to know, particularly other solar industry professionals that are watching this, whether on the manufacturing side, on the installation side? What do you think they need to be considering now as we about to enter 2026?
Well, my younger brother runs an installation company, took it over from me. I think that's the same thing that, I think he and I are chatting about at breakfast every few weeks is, look, you need to go after, where the virtual power plant opportunities are. You need to figure out a way to have an honest conversation with your customers about that. But that's real money to subsidize for on the sales side. Focus on your bottom line in terms of what's your hardware stack that you're using. Can you afford it next year? Some of the big companies are focusing only on TPO qualifying hardware, and that's going to increase the prices of your hardware, not decrease them. And if you need a solution for your cash customers, figure that out. And just hang in there. We're headed into an energy crisis. The next 5 years are going to be great for this industry. We might have a 6-month hiccup. Keep your eyes on that for 6 months, and really kind of figure out what you want to do with any kind of a TPO, VPP play, how to have an honest conversation, build a good business with your customers around that, and ultimately, you're going to be in a great spot the next 5 years. People are going to want backup, and power prices are going to go up.
All right. Well, there you have it, folks. Again, this has been a conversation with James Showalter. He's the founder and CEO of EG4 Electronics. Of course, one of the brands that we've been covering the last couple of years quite frequently here on the channel. But James, I really appreciate you spending some more time with us. Thanks for coming on this podcast episode with me.
Thanks for having me, Joe. See you later.
Anytime. Well, folks, that does it for today's episode. I thank you all for spending some more time on the Solar Surge channel. And as always, I'm Joe Ordia here, encouraging you to get prepared and be empowered. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next program.